Good morning and glad to be with you. Just thanks for the opportunity to present a little bit about our varieties from the University of Florida. The first three there I've listed, the 331, 297, and T61 are our high oleic types, and those have been around a little while, so I won't concentrate as much on those, but the other two, the Flow Run 52N and Arnie, are our newest normal oleics. And for a long time, we at the University of Florida did not really focus on normal oleics, but the industry has indicated a strong desire to have those types. So these are our first two normal oleics in quite a few years. So just going through the varieties a little bit, the 297's been around a while. It's a large seeded runner. And if you notice from Mr. Skaggs' presentation, most of it's grown over in South Carolina, where they tend to grow more high oleics. It's a medium maturing type, strong yield potential, good grades, moderately susceptible to white mold and susceptible to leaf spot, and pretty good tolerance to spotted wilt in our tests, and good yields under TSWV pressure. The 331 is a smaller seeded runner type, also grown mostly over in South Carolina, but growers in our area have done well with it. So it's a medium maturing type too. We say 140 days under irrigation in Florida. 3-ton yield potential there as well. Pretty good grades, maybe not quite as strong as 297, but good nonetheless. Moderately resistant to white mold, leaf spot is susceptible and has some susceptibility to spotted wilt. But it does seem to do well in adverse conditions. We've seen in non-irrigated conditions where it does pretty well comparatively. The T61 is our latest high oleic release. It's a little bit larger seeded than 331, but not much. It's still fairly small overall. It's a little bit later, I'd say 145 days, maybe in that medium plus type category, 3-ton yield potential, good grades. Among the best in terms of white mold resistance that are out there. Not quite as good as 12Y, but a little better than others. Susceptible to leaf spot and pretty good tolerance to spotted wilt as well. Has done well in our tests and in our own farm tests as well. I'll show you later. All right, the 52N, our first normal oleic release. The N does not stand for nematode. It stands for normal. I guess I was a little excited about having a normal oleic release. I put an N there, and then somebody said, is it nematode resistant? I said, no, sorry, it's not. I wish it was. But it is a small seeded runner, medium maturity, 3-ton yield potential, very good grades. I'll show you some data on that from on-farm tests as well. Moderately susceptible to all those three diseases. It's kind of interesting. It's not great in any one category against those diseases, but it tends to hold up pretty well against all of them, especially with good fungicide programs. It tends to respond well to those and not be overly susceptible to spotted wilt. It does have a little bit smaller vines. We've heard growers like that. It's not quite so viney, so difficult to harvest when you're digging or when you're picking. Tend to invert well. The good grades as well are showing up in our on-farm tests. The Arnie is our latest normal oleic release. It's smaller, about the same size as seed size as 52N. Also medium maturity, 3-ton yield potential. Grades are also very good. One thing interesting about Arnie is that about 20% of the pods have 3 seeds in them. So just so you know, you're not looking at something that's not a runner type. It is a runner type. It's just that the parental material that we used, if you were here earlier for Dr. Culberth's presentation, you notice he showed how strong a resistance it has to spotted wilt. It really is very strong there. And this 3-cell trait also traces back to some of the material we use that has the strong spotted wilt resistance. Way back before I started at the University of Florida, my predecessor, Dr. Gorbett, was working with some material called hirsuta types, and those types had very strong resistance to tomato spotted wilt, and this is where Arnie gets its resistance from. But they also had some interesting pod characteristics that were like this, that had the longer pod. So about 20% of those will have 3 seeds in them based on what we've seen so far. It is moderately susceptible to white mold and leaf spot, so strong fungicide programs will be helpful there. And you know, we talked about this as a strength for early planting, having good spotted wilt tolerance, a strength for early planting in areas where spotted wilt is a problem. And that's really a potential strength for Arnie as well. So just kind of a summary here. This is the numbers you see there, the peanut disease index for 2024, showing that Arnie has a 5 there compared to 10 and 15 and 20 for the other varieties. Pretty similar on leaf spot and white mold through all of those. I won't go through every one of them that are in your book. And you also have the seed per pound in your book as well, so you can see which ones are smaller. And kind of what I think the planting dates could be for those varieties based on their spotted wilt tolerance especially. But be aware that even though we say earlier planting for something that has stronger spotted wilt tolerance, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be protected for other from other diseases, simply because we know that almost all the varieties, all the varieties have some susceptibility to white mold and leaf spot, so good fungicide programs are important. And especially if you're planting earlier, that means higher risk for white mold, so better protection there. If you're planting later, then better protection for leaf spot will be important. So those are some factors to consider in looking at these varieties. So a little bit of data as well, looking at the period from 2022 to 2024, irrigated and non-irrigated tests. These are multiple locations in Florida as well. The 331, Arnie 297 there towards the top along with 12Y. And so, looking very good. And our small plot data is what we have to do to test a lot of varieties. To compare a lot of varieties, we have to do small plot data. But I sort of look at it as a way that sort of begins to categorize and sort of narrow down the field and gets us in the ballpark. What really matters is when it gets into your fields and you start to grow it to see what it looks like. So we do on-farm demonstrations as well, comparing our varieties as we get enough seed. We really can't do this before we get to the point of release because we just don't have enough seed. But once we get enough seed, we can put them on farm, so we collaborate with our county agents. And it depends on each year's a few different number of counties and what have you, but they grow these tests in about 1 to 2 acre size plots. They're planted by them, managed by them, and harvested by them. Then most of the time they're taking these to buying points. So the grade you see here would be what came from federal state inspection. So it's as close to real world as we can get in terms of comparing the varieties. So here we had 4 counties, and here you see a summary. These were a mix of irrigated, non-irrigated. In fact, 2 irrigated. Jackson and Hamilton were irrigated. Holmes and Washington were not irrigated. You see there on the far right-hand side the summary of those with the yield and grade there. So the 52N strong grades, T61 strong yields, a little bit lower grades, but again, this is how they're performing in a real-world scenario in 2023. That was a pretty tough year for us in some of these areas. The yields were a little bit lower than what we've seen, but due to the dry weather in the fall. In 2024, we had 8 counties represented here, about half and half, irrigated, not irrigated. And if you look at this, we had added Arnie and 52N to the list. We didn't have them before. You can see that just on average how they perform. 52N was typically the higher yielding at each location, and it averaged out at the end to be the highest yielding one among those 8 on-farm locations. And Arnie was right behind it. Both of them were over 5,000 compared to T61 and the check. And I should mention what I mean by check. So I didn't list a variety there, but the check was depending on whatever the farmer grew in the field. So if they were growing 06G, which is about 5 out of 8 locations were 06G, the other ones were 12Y, T61 and 297. So that's averaging those together just to compare what the farmer was growing in their field. But again, most of that was 06G. So just summarizing that, looking at the grade as well. Again, this is the same yield information as the right-hand summary you were looking at. Just added the grade in there to look at. So the Arnie and 52N had the highest yield and the highest grade among those varieties. So they look really good in terms of their overall potential for return per acre. So with that, I'll thank you and ask you for any questions. I'll be glad to try and answer them.